She'll be out in 5 minutes. 10 if security is slow tonight. Matthew Hargrove said it into the rim of his bourbon glass, and the men around him laughed the way men laugh when they know they shouldn't, too loud, too fast, already reaching for their phones. The Hargrove Gala. One night a year. The kind of event where an invitation wasn't printed so much as bestowed, where the governor of Illinois worked the room before the appetizers landed and where crime lords stood 3 feet from federal judges and everyone understood, without being told, that tonight the only law that mattered was the law of the guest list. Rose had spent the last hour in the kitchen hallway. Uniform pressed. Eyes forward. Champagne flutes balanced on a silver tray that she held steady even when Matthew's friend stumbled past her without looking, the way you don't look at furniture. 3 years of this. 3 years of making herself small in rooms that didn't deserve her. She had learned the particular discipline of invisibility, answer in fewer words than asked, never correct, never react, let the condescension move through you like cold air through a window crack, feel it, then let it out the other side. Matthew spotted her from across the hallway. She saw the idea form on his face before he even moved toward her. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a gold-embossed invitation, the one meant for a business contact who'd cancelled an hour ago. He held it between 2 fingers the way you hold something disposable, and when he pressed it into her hand, he was already half turned back toward his audience. Go on, sweetheart. Mix with the guests. His eyes were bright with it, the particular shine of a man who thinks he's being funny and dangerous at the same time. Let's see how long before they figure out which side of the door you belong on. Laughter. His girlfriend covered her mouth. Someone held up a phone. Rose looked down at the invitation. Then she looked at Matthew, 1 full second, unhurried, her hazel eyes giving him absolutely nothing. She set the champagne tray down on the hallway table. Smoothed the front of her uniform with both hands, slow and deliberate, like a woman who had all the time in the world. Then she turned and walked toward the ballroom doors. The laughter was still going when she pushed through them. It stopped the moment the doors closed behind her. Not because of anything Rose did. Because across that gilded, chandelier-blazing room, past the senators and the socialites and the men who ran this city from shadows, a wine glass went completely still in a very large, very tattooed hand. Tony Ricci had not moved in 4 seconds. That, in this room, was the loudest thing that had happened all night. She thought she was walking into a joke. She had no idea she was walking into the end of 3 years of hiding, and that the most dangerous man in Chicago had spent every one of those years looking for her. But that story starts somewhere else. It starts in a downtown office on a summer afternoon, with a door opening and a man she never expected to meet, and 45 minutes that neither of them had ever forgotten. Tony Ricci had been mid-sentence. That was the part nobody in the room could reconcile, not the governor's chief of staff, not the 3 federal judges nursing scotch by the east wall, not the pair of men in the corner who worked for someone other than Tony and were paid, specifically, to watch him. Tony had been mid-sentence, speaking to the governor of Illinois in the low, unhurried register of a man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard, and then he simply stopped. Not trailed off. Stopped. The governor turned to follow his eye line. Saw nothing that explained it. Turned back to find Tony already setting his wine glass down on a passing server's tray, carefully, without looking, already buttoning the single button of his black jacket with one hand. Then he walked. Nobody walks like that in a room like this. Nobody moves with that kind of forward intention through a space where every step is a social transaction, where you pause for senators, redirect for crime lords, perform for anyone worth performing for. Tony Ricci performed for no one. His security detail registered the movement and adjusted without a word, falling back, giving him the room to do whatever he was doing. They had worked for this man long enough to know, when he moved like that, you cleared the path. You did not ask questions. Every head turned. It happened in sequence, like a slow wave rolling across the ballroom, the nearest cluster first, then the next, then the governor's aide touching the governor's arm, then the two men by the east wall going rigid in the particular way of people recalculating a situation in real time. The socialite stopped mid-laugh. The senators stopped mid-pitch. Even the string quartet, which had no reason to notice anything, seemed to lose half a note of confidence. Because Tony Ricci was crossing the entire length of the ballroom. Toward a woman in a maid's uniform. Rose saw him coming when he was still 20 feet away, and every quiet, careful survival instinct she had spent 3 years sharpening fired at once, a cold rush from her chest to her fingertips. She clocked the exits. Service door to her left, 40 feet and a crowd of bodies between her and it. Main entrance behind her, but Tony's path cut directly across it. She ran the math in the space of 2 heartbeats and arrived at the only honest answer. She wouldn't make it 2 steps. So she stood still. He reached her without slowing. There was no pause for assessment, no moment of hesitation. His hand went to the small of her back, not grabbing, not pressing, nothing that could be called force. Just a flat, steady placement. The hand of a man who knew exactly where he was putting it and had decided, in front of every consequential person in Chicago, that this was where it belonged. He didn't look at the room. He looked at her. Then, in a voice that wasn't loud, didn't need to be, he said. She's with me. She's always been with me. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. Shock is loud, underneath, full of sharp breaths and shifting weight and the electricity of people deciding how to react. This was something else. This was the silence of a room full of dangerous, calculating people all arriving at the same conclusion simultaneously and choosing, without discussion, not to contest it. The governor did not finish his sentence. Matthew's bourbon stopped 4 inches from his lips. His girlfriend's smile didn't fade so much as evacuate, there one moment, simply gone the next, like a light switched off by someone who finally understood the room. Not a clink. Not a murmur. Not a single heel shifting on marble. Tony still didn't look up. His eyes stayed on Rose, and for just a fraction of a second, beneath the authority and the stillness and the absolute certainty of a man who had not been surprised in years, something else moved across his face. Not power. Relief. The pure, exhaled relief of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had just, in the middle of the most watched room in Chicago, been allowed to set it down. Across the ballroom, Matthew Hargrove stood with his bourbon still raised, the laughter completely gone from his face, watching Tony Ricci's hand on the back of his Maid, and understanding, with a slow and sickening clarity, that he had no idea what he had done. He had invited her in as a joke. He no longer controlled a single thing about this night. 3 years earlier, Rose Callahan didn't own a single uniform. She was 22, home from Northwestern for the summer, carrying a brown paper bag of takeout through the lobby of a downtown Chicago office building, the kind of building that didn't advertise its tenants, where the elevator buttons weren't labeled and the receptionist on the 14th floor knew her by face but had never once said her father's name out loud. That was simply how things worked in Daniel Callahan's world. Quietly. Deliberately. Without footnotes. Her father was not a famous man. He had arranged his entire life around ensuring that. For 15 years, Daniel Callahan had managed the Ricci family's financial architecture from the deep, comfortable shadows of legitimacy, shell companies, investment vehicles, the kind of paper infrastructure that made dirty money lie down and behave. His name appeared on nothing that mattered. He preferred it that way. The people he worked for preferred it more. Rose knew the broad outline. She had never asked for the details. That, too, was simply how things worked. She was waiting in the hallway outside his office, bag in hand, when the door opened. The man who walked out was not her father. He was large in the way that fills a doorframe without trying, broad through the shoulders, neck tattoos climbing toward a jaw that looked like it had been set into place by someone with strong opinions about angles. He wore a suit that cost more than Rose's semester tuition and moved with the particular unhurried authority of someone who had never once in his adult life needed to prove that he belonged somewhere. He looked at her. She looked back. Tony Ricci said, with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, "You must be Daniel's daughter. You must be the reason he never brings his work home," Rose said. He didn't smile. But something shifted, a fractional recalibration behind his eyes, like a man who had just been handed an unexpected variable. He told her father's secretary to push his next call 20 minutes. Then he leaned against the hallway wall, still holding his phone, and talked to her. Not about the family. Not about her father. About Chicago, the version most people never learn to read. About the difference between power that accumulates quietly over decades and power that announces itself loudly and collapses inside of 5 years. He spoke about the city the way someone speaks about a language they've spent their whole life learning to read between the lines of. Rose pushed back. Twice. On the thing about legacy, and then again on the thing about loyalty. He stopped both times and actually listened. Nobody pushed back on Tony Ricci. She didn't know that yet. She found out later, much later, that the 45 minutes they spent in that hallway were something people who had worked for him for a decade had never managed to earn. He left without ceremony. No card, no parting instruction. Rose carried the takeout into her father's office and set it on his desk and said, without fully understanding why she was saying it, "He's not what I expected." Daniel Callahan looked up from his papers. He went quiet in a particular way, not thoughtfully quiet, not distracted quiet. The quiet of a man absorbing something he didn't know how to answer. He held it for 3 full seconds before he picked up his fork. She should have asked what that silence meant. She didn't. 6 months later, Daniel Callahan was found at his desk on a Tuesday morning. The official ruling was cardiac arrest. Natural causes. The investigation, such as it was, closed in 11 days. Rose stood in his empty apartment on a Thursday night, working through his things with the hollow efficiency of grief that hasn't fully arrived yet, opening drawers, closing them, trying to find the edges of a life that had been so deliberately contained there was almost nothing left on the surface to grieve. She almost missed it. Taped to the underside of his desk drawer, not hidden, exactly, but placed with care, the way you place something you hope the right person will eventually think to look for, was a small black encrypted drive. Rose held it in her palm for a long time. Then she made a decision. By morning, Rose Callahan would be gone. Her father had never explained why he taught her these things. Not directly. It came in pieces, over years, casual, almost offhand, the way you teach a child to swim by degrees rather than dropping them in deep water. If you ever needed to start over somewhere new, here is how a paper trail gets built from nothing. Not a warning. Not an instruction. A quiet, careful transmission from a man who spent his professional life understanding that some knowledge was worth passing on without explaining why you had it. Rose understood why, the morning she left his apartment with an encrypted drive sewn into the lining of her coat. The new name took 4 days to build into something functional. A resume constructed with the particular patience of someone who understood what references actually get checked and what details make an interviewer's eyes move on to the next line. Hair darker, not dramatically, just enough to shift the first impression. No social media presence, which in her previous life had been modest enough that its disappearance created no visible absence. Cash only for the first year, which meant a specific kind of tired, the tired of counting and rationing and making every transaction invisible. She moved through 3 domestic service positions across Illinois over 18 months. Each one carefully chosen. Each one unremarkable. She was good at the work because she applied to it the same focused discipline she had once applied to her coursework at Northwestern, the difference being that now the goal wasn't excellence. The goal was invisibility. You couldn't be invisible if you were memorable. You couldn't be memorable if you were excellent. She found the precise middle register of adequate and she lived there, quietly, for 3 years. The Hargrove estate came through a placement agency in Evanston. Matthew never looked past the references, why would he? She arrived on a Tuesday with 2 bags and a coat she refused to check at the door, was shown the staff quarters, and was told to start Thursday. He looked at her for approximately 4 seconds before his eyes moved back to his phone. She was just the maid. That was the point. The daily discipline of it had its own specific weight. Eyes down in every room that didn't require otherwise. Answers compressed to their smallest functional form, yes, Mr. Hargrove, of course, right away, no surplus words, no unsolicited observations, no reactions to the small cruelties that accumulate naturally in houses where some people are paid to absorb them. 3 years of swallowing who she used to be in careful, daily increments. The girl who pushed back on Tony Ricci in a downtown hallway. The Northwestern junior who argued comparative ethics at 11 at night over terrible dining hall coffee. That person existed somewhere beneath the uniform, waiting with a patience that surprised even Rose. And the drive was always there. Sewn into the inner lining of a charcoal winter coat she kept on a hook beside her bed in the staff quarters, always accessible, never checked, never touched except on the nights when the weight of carrying it made sleep impossible and she needed to confirm with her fingertips that it was still real. Her father's entire life's work. 15 years of meticulous, encrypted documentation, waiting for the right moment and the right person and the right circumstances to mean something. She carried it the way you carry a debt to someone who can no longer collect. What Rose didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Tony's people had been looking for her since the week of Daniel's funeral. They had traced her to the first address, a sublease in Rockford, and arrived 4 days after she'd left. The second address, a service position in Naperville, yielded a forwarding gap she had deliberately constructed. The trail went cold both times cleanly, completely, with a thoroughness that Tony's head of security, a man not easily impressed, found himself quietly noting in a way that felt less like frustration and more like respect. She was better at disappearing than anyone had given her credit for. 18 months before the night of the Hargrove Gala, Tony Ricci sat across from that same head of security in a corner booth of a restaurant that had been closed for the evening, a glass of water untouched in front of him, his hands flat on the table. "Find her," he said. "She's either hiding or she's dead. I need to know which one." His man nodded once. Tony turned to look out the window at the Chicago street below. His jaw held the particular stillness of a man keeping something carefully contained. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, not softer, but lower in the way of something that comes from further down than the chest. "Her father trusted me with everything he had. I failed him." A pause. "I won't fail her twice." 2 weeks before the gala, the restaurant on Michigan Avenue had been closed for 90 minutes. The staff was gone. The lights above the bar had been dimmed to the kind of low that makes a room feel smaller than it is, more private than it deserves to be. Matthew Hargrove sat in the corner booth with a bourbon he hadn't touched and the particular careful posture of a man trying not to look like he understood the gravity of the meeting he had agreed to attend. Victor Crane sat across from him and looked like he understood it completely. Crane was not a large man. That was the first thing people always noted, afterward, when they tried to explain why they hadn't taken him more seriously on first impression. Medium height, silver at the temples, the kind of face that read as unremarkable until you noticed his eyes, which were the flat, patient eyes of someone who had never once in his life made a decision in a hurry. He had spent 3 years quietly dismantling Tony Ricci's peripheral operations from the outside in, acquiring territory and leverage with the methodical appetite of a man playing a long game that most people around him hadn't realized had already started. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and slid a photograph across the table. Grainy grocery store camera footage, printed on plain paper, the timestamp in the corner reading 14 months earlier. But identifiable. A young woman in a dark coat at a checkout line, her face turned slightly away from the camera in the practiced, unconscious habit of someone who had spent years calibrating how much of herself to present to any given lens. Matthew looked at it. Then at Crane. "Her name is Rose," Crane said, in the tone of someone confirming a fact that is already settled. "She works in your house. Has for almost 2 years." He let that land. Then he explained, with the same unhurried patience, what she carried. What her father had spent 15 years building and what those encrypted ledgers represented to the people who wanted them, and to the people who wanted them destroyed. Crane had been hunting the Callahan documentation since the week Daniel died. He had been closer than Rose knew, twice. Both times she had slipped the net with a cleanliness that had cost him 2 operational teams and 14 months of rebuilt groundwork. He was not going to miss a third time. The offer was clean. $800,000, half on agreement, half on confirmation, for Matthew to do 2 things: verify Rose's identity formally and get her into a public space with enough bodies and enough chaos that Crane's men could move on her quietly, without a scene, without a trace. The gala was ideal. Packed. Loud. The kind of event where a staff member stepping outside and not coming back would be attributed to nerves or dismissal before anyone thought to ask further questions. Matthew's hesitation lasted approximately 40 seconds. He told himself it was just business. Crane was a businessman, unconventional, yes, operating in channels Matthew preferred not to examine closely, but this was Chicago, and Chicago ran on arrangements between people who understood that the machinery of the city required a certain pragmatic flexibility. He told himself Rose was a maid. He told himself a maid was a maid. He told himself these things with enough conviction that by the time he shook Crane's hand across the table, he had almost started to believe them. What Victor Crane did not tell Matthew, what Crane had deliberately, calculatedly withheld, was that Tony Ricci had confirmed his attendance at the Hargrove Gala 48 hours earlier. A last-minute addition to the guest list. A scheduling shift that Crane's contact inside the event coordination had flagged and that Crane had assessed and dismissed. Tony's presence complicated the optics, not the operation. His security detail would be watching the exits, the perimeter, the predictable vectors. They would not be watching the interior of the room for a woman in a maid's uniform whom Tony Ricci had not seen in 3 years and had no reason to expect would be there. Crane had assumed Tony's men would be watching the exits. He had assumed Tony would be watching the room the way powerful men watch rooms, scanning for threats, measuring rivals, performing the social calculus of dominance that these events existed to facilitate. He had not assumed Tony would stop mid-conversation with the governor of Illinois because a woman in a white uniform walked through a set of ballroom doors. He had assumed wrong. In the present, across the ballroom, Matthew Hargrove stood with his bourbon suspended halfway to his mouth and watched Tony Ricci's hand settle against the small of Rose's back, steady, deliberate, unmistakable, and felt the full arithmetic of his miscalculation arrive all at once, like a set of numbers he had been avoiding that had finally balanced themselves into a sum he couldn't dispute. He had confirmed her identity. He had gotten her into the room. He had done exactly what he was paid to do. He had not been paid to account for this. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. He looked anyway, the way you look at something terrible because looking away feels worse. A message from Crane's number. 5 words. Why is she still standing? Matthew stared at it. He didn't answer. His thumb hovered over the screen and then lowered without pressing anything, because there was no answer that would help him now, no explanation that would reframe what Tony Ricci had just done in front of every senator and crime lord in the city of Chicago. He set the phone back in his pocket. He could not feel his hands. Tony moved her without making it look like movement. One hand still at the small of her back, a subtle shift in direction, not toward an exit, not toward any door that might read as retreat. Just a repositioning, steady and unhurried, steering her to a quieter section of the ballroom where the crowd thinned and the chandeliers cast a slightly warmer light and there was, incidentally, a clear sightline to every corner of the room. His security detail adjusted without instruction, closing the perimeter at a distance that was respectful enough to allow conversation and close enough to communicate everything that needed communicating. The room recalibrated around them in real time. It happened in layers. The governor's aide bent close to the governor's ear and said something that made the governor's expression shift from confusion into the careful blankness of a man who has just been briefed on a situation and has decided, wisely, that he has no role in it. Near the east wall, 2 men in dark suits who had arrived together and spent the evening occupying the same fixed position exchanged a look that lasted less than a second, then both reached into their jacket pockets for their phones simultaneously, the choreography of people receiving new instructions before they'd finished processing the old ones. The socialites who had laughed in the hallway, the ones who had covered their mouths and reached for each other's arms with the giddy cruelty of people watching something embarrassing happen to someone below them, now found urgent interest in their champagne, in the middle distance, in anything that wasn't rose. The geometry of the room had shifted entirely. The woman they had dismissed 20 minutes ago was now standing inside the most protected radius in Chicago, and not one of them was willing to let their earlier laughter show on their face. Power doesn't announce its transfers. It just becomes visible, like a current you couldn't see until something moved with it. Tony spoke to her quietly. Not the voice he had used to address the room, that had been a different instrument entirely, built for range and authority and the specific acoustics of a crowd that needed to understand something without being told twice. This was smaller. Steadier. The voice of a man being careful with something he hadn't expected to be holding tonight. He didn't explain. Not yet. He asked her one question. How long have you been here? At the estate. Rose said. Almost 2 years. In Chicago. Under whatever name you've been using. She held his gaze. 3 years. Something moved behind his eyes, a brief, unguarded passage of something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief and didn't fully resolve into either before he brought it back under governance. 3 years. His people had been searching for 3 years, had lost her trail twice, had reported back to him in that closed restaurant 18 months ago with nothing but a cold address and a professional admission that she had simply been better at vanishing than they had been at finding. 3 years in the same city. 3 years in a maid's uniform in a North Shore estate while he sat 20 minutes away carrying the weight of a debt he couldn't repay to a dead man. He didn't let it fully form. Not here. Not in this room. Victor Crane was 40 feet away in a navy tuxedo, standing beside a woman who was no longer listening to him. He was already aware of the situation, had been aware of it from the moment Tony crossed the ballroom floor, had spent the intervening minutes running the same calculations that every other dangerous person in the room had run and arriving at the same conclusion. But awareness and acceptance are different things, and Crane was not a man who accepted conclusions without at least testing them once. He looked at Tony directly. A single beat of eye contact across the width of the room, measuring, recalculating, searching for any crack in the surface that might indicate this was performance rather than commitment. Tony held it for 3 seconds. Crane looked away first. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't visible to most of the room. But it was absolute, the quiet, definitive closing of a door that Crane had been intending to walk through tonight. His 2 men near the east wall were already moving, gravitating toward exits with the practiced casualness of people trained to leave rooms without appearing to leave them. Rose watched it happen. She had spent 3 years learning to read spaces, which rooms were safe, which exits were real, which silences meant nothing and which ones meant everything. She read Crane's retreat the way she would read a weather shift, cataloging what it meant, that Tony's arrival tonight had not been coordinated, not been expected, not been part of any plan that included her. That 48 hours earlier, the entire architecture of this evening had looked completely different. That she had walked through those ballroom doors not into safety, but into a moment that could have gone in a direction she did not want to finish imagining. She turned and looked at Tony. "You didn't know I was here." Not a question. The flat, certain delivery of a woman who had just finished doing the math and trusted her arithmetic. Tony looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't." Rose exhaled, slow, controlled, the careful release of 3 years of breath she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding. Sal appeared at Tony's left shoulder with the soundless efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years learning how to materialize in exactly this way, present without arriving, close without crowding. He bent slightly and murmured something close to Tony's ear, his expression giving nothing to the room. Tony listened without turning his head. When Sal finished, Tony's jaw tightened, not dramatically, just a single, fractional hardening, the kind of physical response so controlled it would be invisible to anyone who didn't know what his face looked like at rest. He let his eyes move, once, across the room to where Matthew Hargrove stood alone at the bar. He looked at Matthew for exactly the length of time it took to confirm what he had just been told. Then he looked away. His expression had changed. Not anger, Tony Ricci angry was something the room would have felt, a pressure shift, a drop in temperature. This was something colder and more precise than anger. This was the expression of a man who had just been handed the complete picture and found it exactly as ugly as he had suspected and was now simply deciding, with perfect patience, what to do about it. This was the expression of a man who had information. Sal crossed the ballroom the way he did everything, without announcement, without ceremony, generating no more social friction than a man returning from the restroom. He didn't make eye contact with anyone he passed. He didn't adjust his pace. He arrived beside Matthew Hargrove at the bar with the quiet, purposeful arrival of someone completing a task that had been decided elsewhere, by someone else, several minutes ago. He set a phone on the polished mahogany next to Matthew's bourbon glass. Screen up. Already open. Then he took one step back and folded his hands and waited, with the patient, empty expression of a man who had delivered difficult information to difficult people enough times to have stopped finding it interesting. Matthew looked at the phone the way you look at something you already know is going to be bad, the half-second delay of a person who understands that the moment before knowing is the last comfortable moment available to them. Then he looked at the screen. The text thread was thorough. Crane's number at the top, unambiguous. Meeting dates that corresponded precisely to the evenings Matthew had logged in his own calendar as private dinner. Dollar amounts in 2 installments, the second marked with a single word, confirmed. Rose's photograph, the same grainy grocery store image Crane had slid across the table 2 weeks ago, with a timestamp and a short line of text beneath it that left no interpretive room whatsoever. Confirm she's yours and get her into the open. Matthew's mouth opened. Sal looked at him the way you look at a traffic cone, acknowledging its presence as an object without assigning it any particular significance. When Matthew's first shapeless syllable of denial made it approximately halfway into the air between them, Sal said, in a tone so level it was almost considerate. "Mr. Ricci doesn't need you to explain. He just needed you to see that he knows." Matthew closed his mouth. His girlfriend had been standing close enough to see the screen. She didn't say anything, didn't gasp, didn't ask a question, didn't perform any of the reactions that the moment might have otherwise invited. She simply stepped away from him. One quiet step to the side, then another, the careful lateral movement of a person recalibrating which side of a line they intend to be standing on. Within 30 seconds she had been absorbed into a cluster of women near the far end of the bar and had not looked back. His two closest friends, the ones who had laughed the loudest in the hallway, who had reached for their phones with the gleeful appetite of people anticipating content, found reasons to be elsewhere with a speed that would have impressed Matthew under any other circumstances. One developed a sudden interest in the canopy table. The other simply turned and walked away, not quickly enough to be rude and not slowly enough to suggest he'd considered staying. The radius around Matthew Hargrove expanded in quiet, incremental abandonment. Across the room, Tony watched. He watched Matthew's face move through its complete journey, the shock first, sharp and genuine, the brief bright flare of a man who has not yet accepted what he is seeing. Then the denial, which lasted slightly longer than the shock and expressed itself not in words but in the particular tension of someone constructing an argument they already know won't be made. Then the calculation, the fast, desperate arithmetic of a man searching for an exit, a lever, any remaining variable he might still control. Then, finally, the collapse. Not dramatic. Not visible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. Just a subtle, irreversible settling, the expression of a man who has run out of moves and arrived at the understanding that the room he has hosted for the last decade no longer belongs to him in any way that matters. Tony watched all of it. Then he turned back to Rose. There was no satisfaction in his expression. Not even the cold, distant cousin of satisfaction that sometimes passes for justice in rooms like this one. Matthew Hargrove had never been the point. Matthew was a mechanism, a tool that a more dangerous and more deliberate man had identified, assessed, and picked up because it was available and cheap and required no particular maintenance. Crane had needed a door opened. Matthew had opened it. That was the complete extent of Matthew's significance in the architecture of this evening, and Tony had already moved past it. He gave Sal a single slight nod. Sal stepped away from the bar and made one phone call, brief and quiet, standing near the coatroom where the ambient noise of the gala covered the specifics. The call lasted under 2 minutes. The information transferred during those 2 minutes was anonymous, detailed, and comprehensive, the kind of tip that arrives at a federal financial crimes unit with everything already organized, every thread already labeled, every connection already mapped in the precise, legible handwriting of someone who does not make mistakes. By midnight, Matthew Hargrove's name was flagged. By morning, the machinery would already be moving. Matthew stood at the bar alone. The phone was still on the mahogany in front of him, screen dimmed now but present, a small, dark rectangle that represented the complete cost of a decision he had spent approximately 40 seconds making 2 weeks ago in a closed restaurant on Michigan Avenue. His bourbon was untouched, the ice long dissolved, the glass leaving a ring on the bar that no one was going to wipe up because the staff had, with the subtle professional instinct of people trained to read rooms, stopped attending to his end of the bar some time ago. He watched the gala continue without him. He watched the clusters of conversation reform and shift and flow around the room's new gravitational center, toward the corner where Tony Ricci stood with his hand no longer at Rose's back but his presence still arranged around her like a fact the room had accepted and incorporated. He watched senators adjust their positioning. He watched the governor's chief of staff make his way, with careful casualness, toward Tony's corner. He watched the room he had spent a decade curating and hosting and presiding over operate with complete, seamless indifference to his existence within it. Being brought down by the woman he had sent through those doors as a joke. The woman who had never raised her voice, never corrected him, never reacted to a single one of the small daily cruelties he had dealt from the comfortable elevation of a man who owned the floor she cleaned. The woman who had set down a champagne tray, smoothed her uniform with both hands, and walked through a set of double doors without saying a single word to anyone. Not one word. And she hadn't needed to. They left through a side entrance off the catering corridor. No announcement, no visible departure, Tony simply guided Rose through a door that Sal had already positioned himself beside, and then they were in a narrow service hallway that smelled of cold air and linen, and then they were outside, and the black SUV was already waiting at the curb with the engine running and the rear door open, because in Tony Ricci's world the car was always already there. The Chicago skyline blazed through the tinted windows as they pulled into the Gold Coast traffic, the kind of city light that doesn't dim even at this hour, that turns the clouds orange from below and makes the river glow when you cross it. Rose sat with her coat in her lap and watched the city move past and didn't speak. Tony sat with his jacket buttoned and his hands loose and didn't speak either. The silence held for a full city block. 2, almost. Then Tony said, "I want to tell you about your father. Not about the gala. Not about Crane, not about Matthew, not about the machinery already moving in the background of this evening on multiple fronts." He set all of it aside and told her about Daniel, beginning with what Daniel had found, and when, and how. Crane had been siphoning from the Ricci family accounts for nearly 2 years before Daniel identified it, small enough withdrawals, routed through enough layered shell structures, to evade the standard reviews. Daniel had found it by accident, following an arithmetic inconsistency that most people would have attributed to clerical error and moved past. He hadn't moved past it. He had pulled the thread with the meticulous, unhurried patience of a man who had spent 15 years building financial architecture specifically because he understood how it could be hidden in. He had documented everything. Amounts, dates, entities, transfer chains, all of it encrypted, all of it precise, all of it building toward a complete picture of what Crane had taken and how. Crane found out that Daniel knew. Tony paused here. Kept his eyes on the window. "I didn't find out what he'd done until 4 days after the funeral. The evidence came to my desk, anonymously, through a channel Daniel must have set up in advance as a contingency. By the time I understood the full picture, you were already gone." The city slid past. A stoplight. The dark gap of the river approaching. "I should have had men on him." Tony's voice didn't change in register, didn't tighten, didn't drop. It carried instead the particular flatness of a sentence that has been said internally so many times it has worn itself smooth. "I knew Crane was dangerous. I knew Daniel was exposed. I made a calculation that the financial architecture was enough insulation, that nobody would move against an accountant, that the risk was abstract." A pause that lasted the length of a city block. "I was wrong. That's on me. It will always be on me." Rose had not moved since he started speaking, her hands were in her lap, still and separate, the way hands go when the body is concentrating everything on listening. She had not looked at him. She had watched the city, the streetlights, the storefronts, the dark water of the river as they crossed it, and let his words arrive without deflecting any of them, without softening them through reaction or commentary. She gave his accounting of it the same respect her father would have given it, complete, unflinching attention. When Tony finished, the car was quiet again. Then Rose reached into her coat. Not her pocket. The inner lining, the interior seam she had reinforced herself 18 months ago with a needle and heavy thread in the staff quarters of the Hargrove estate on a Sunday night while the rest of the house slept. She worked the small concealed opening with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it in the dark, in a hurry, in conditions considerably less comfortable than the back of a heated SUV, and produced a small black encrypted drive that she held for a moment in her palm before extending it toward him. Tony looked at it. Then at her. "He gave me instructions," she said. "Specific ones. Written out, left with the drive. If anything ever happened to him, find someone worth trusting and hand this over." She held his gaze with the steady, direct quality that had been one of the first things he had noticed about her in that downtown hallway 3 years ago, the quality of someone who had decided to say a thing and was going to finish saying it. "I've been waiting 3 years to find that person." The drive sat in the space between them. Tony took it. He held it for a moment in his closed hand, this small, weightless object that contained 15 years of Daniel Callahan's meticulous, dangerous, irreplaceable work. The thing Crane had spent 3 years hunting. The thing Rose had sewn into the lining of a coat and carried through 3 jobs and 3 years of deliberate, exhausting invisibility, waiting, with a patience that staggered him, for the right moment and the right person. He looked at her. Not as someone under his protection, that was true but insufficient. Not as Daniel's daughter, that was where it had started but not where it ended. He looked at her the way you look at someone who has done something that required a quality of character most people never get tested for, and passed, without anyone watching, without recognition, without any guarantee that the waiting would ever resolve into anything. "Your father raised somebody remarkable," he said quietly. Rose turned back to the window. The Chicago River caught the city light below them and held it, dark and steady and moving, the way the city always moves, indifferent, continuous, underneath everything. She looked at it for a long moment. Her reflection in the tinted glass looked back at her, not the maid, not the false name, not the careful, compressed version of herself she had been performing for 3 years. Just Rose. Just the woman who had survived it. Her eyes filled. She didn't stop them. For the first time in 3 years, Rose Callahan let herself cry, quietly, without apology, without the particular discipline of someone who has trained herself not to, while the city blazed past the windows and Tony Ricci sat beside her in respectful, complete silence and did not look away. Matthew Hargrove's world did not end loudly. That was the thing about the kind of destruction Tony Ricci set in motion, it didn't announce itself. It arrived the way water arrives in a foundation, quietly, through the smallest available gaps, and by the time you understood the extent of it, the structure was already compromised beyond the point of repair. Within 72 hours of the gala, his accounts were frozen. Not all at once, that would have been dramatic, and this was not a dramatic process. It was an administrative one, which was worse. Federal investigators appeared at the Gold Coast estate on a Thursday morning in the unremarkable sedan of people who do not need to impress anyone, and they were polite, and they were thorough, and they stayed for 4 hours. His business partners did not wait for charges. They did not wait for a statement, or a denial, or any of the other instruments that might, in a more forgiving world, have provided cover. They distanced themselves before noon on the first day, quietly, by degrees, the way the room at the gala had emptied around him, one recalibrated alliance at a time. The Chicago Tribune ran the story on Friday. Prominent socialite under federal scrutiny. No charges filed. Sources familiar with the investigation. It was 8 paragraphs, placed below the fold, and it was the complete and total sentence, because in Matthew Hargrove's world, scrutiny didn't need to become conviction to become ruin. The doors that closed in the 72 hours after that story ran would not open again. The city had noted what happened when you handed Tony Ricci's enemies a weapon, and the city had quietly, collectively, decided it wanted no proximity to the man who had done it. The joke had cost him everything. The estate. The social architecture he had spent a decade constructing. The girlfriend, who had stepped away from him at the bar and kept stepping. The friends who had laughed in the hallway and would not now return his calls. All of it, rendered irrelevant by a gold-embossed invitation he had pressed into a maid's hand to entertain himself on a Thursday evening. He had sent her and expecting security to drag her out within 10 minutes. She had never been removed from a single room in her life that she hadn't chosen to leave. Victor Crane's indictment came 8 weeks later. 43 federal counts, the kind of number that gets read aloud in a courtroom with a rhythm that accumulates weight as it goes, each count arriving before the last one has fully landed. Daniel Callahan's encrypted drive, processed through Tony's back channel to the FBI's Organized Crime Unit, had provided the foundational architecture, clean, comprehensive, and documented with the meticulous care of a man who had understood, at some level, that he was building something that would need to stand up in court without him. The 3 operatives who had attended the gala were arrested within the month. Crane's organization, without its center of gravity, dissolved in the particular way of structures built on fear rather than loyalty, quickly, and without much noise, each component element recalculating its own survival in the absence of the thing that had made them collectively dangerous. Daniel Callahan's name would not appear in the Tribune. It would appear, quietly and with full weight, in federal court documents. In the precise, formal language of indictments and evidence disclosures and the recorded proceedings of a courtroom where, for the first time, the full accounting of what he had discovered and what it had cost him would be entered into the permanent, public record of what had happened. He had always worked from the shadows. This, at least, would be brought into the light. Tony arranged the apartment on the near north side without making a production of it. A building with a doorman and good locks and a mailbox in the lobby that now read, in small capital letters that Rose stood in front of for a long moment on the first morning, Callahan. Her real name. Printed on something, attached to something, connected to an address that was actually hers, for the first time in 3 years. She re-enrolled at Northwestern the following week. A graduate program she had deferred once and then simply disappeared from, the deferral eventually expiring into an absence that the administrative records noted without understanding. She emailed the department with her real name and a brief explanation that disclosed nothing and asked for everything, and she was readmitted with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested someone had made a call she hadn't asked for and wouldn't ask about. She didn't ask Tony for anything. This was deliberate on her part, and he seemed to understand it, the particular independence of a woman who had survived 3 years alone and needed the survival to mean something about her own capability, not just her circumstances. He didn't offer anything that wasn't offered honestly, without ownership, without the expectation of a particular shape of gratitude. What he offered was straightforward, the apartment, the safety it represented, and the information he passed along when it was relevant to her. Nothing that required her to become something other than what she was. Tony himself did not become a different man. His people had not expected him to. They had watched him for 15 years and understood that the architecture of who he was had been built across too much time and pressure to be renovated by a single night, however significant. He remained what he had always been, precise, patient, dangerous in the specific way of men who have never needed to perform their danger because everyone in the room already knows it. But something in him was quieter. It was subtle enough that only the people who had worked closest to him could identify it, a slight but consistent reduction in the particular tension he had carried for 3 years, the tension of an unresolved debt to a dead man. Sal noticed it first. Then 2 others. None of them mentioned it to each other, but all of them arrived independently at the same observation, that at the weekly briefings, Tony asked after Rose by name. Briefly. Without particular emphasis. The way you check on something you've stopped being afraid of losing, not because you've stopped caring, but because you've finally, carefully, stopped dropping it. Weeks after the gala, on a cold Chicago morning with the kind of sky that can't decide between gray and white, Rose stood outside her building with a coffee and watched the city wake up. The near north side moved with its particular early morning rhythm, the dog walkers and the delivery trucks and the people with their heads down against the wind, all of it ordinary and continuous and entirely indifferent to the fact that she was standing in it under her real name for the first time in 3 years. She had stood in the shower that morning for 20 minutes. She had made coffee in her own kitchen. She had looked at the mailbox in the lobby on her way out and felt something she didn't have an immediate word for, not happiness exactly, not relief exactly, but the quiet and specific sensation of a weight distributed more evenly than it had been, of a person occupying their own life again after years of occupying a careful imitation of one. Her phone buzzed. A message from Tony. No preamble. Crane's arraignment is Thursday. You don't need to be there. But I thought you'd want to know. Rose read it once. Then again. She held the phone in both hands in the cold and looked at the message for a long moment, at the straightforwardness of it, at the particular respect embedded in "you don't need to be there," at the understanding it demonstrated of what she would want and why. She typed back, "Tell me what he looks like when they read the charges." The reply came in 30 seconds. "Smaller than you'd expect." Rose smiled. Not the careful, compressed expression she had deployed for 3 years as a social instrument, the smile that communicated adequate, unobtrusive, not worth looking at twice. This was something else entirely. Unguarded, unperformed, arriving from somewhere below the discipline she had built around herself like a second skin and surfacing without asking permission. The first real smile in 3 years, the kind that reaches everything, that changes the whole face, that belongs entirely to the person wearing it. She stood in the cold Chicago morning and smiled at a text message on her phone, and then she went inside. Her father's name would be spoken in a federal courtroom. The financial architecture he had built in secret over 15 years, the evidence he had encrypted and hidden and trusted to the one person he believed would eventually find the right hands to deliver it to, all of it would be read aloud, entered into the record, made permanent in the language of justice. He would not be there to hear it. But it would be there. His work, his name, the truth of what happened to him, real and documented and spoken in a room built specifically for the purpose of saying, on behalf of people who can no longer speak for themselves, this is what occurred, and this is what it cost, and this is what it means. The joke had cost Matthew everything. It had freed Rose from 3 years of hiding, returned her name to her mailbox and her life to her own hands, and placed the most powerful man in Chicago, quietly, honestly, without ownership or condition, in her corner. Some jokes, it turns out, aren't jokes at all. They're the moment everything finally tips.